Buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos a este nuevo webinar de Value School Pro. Yo soy Andrei Trucmel de Value School y hoy estamos con Pavel Begun, que es cofundador de 3G Capital, una firma especializada en inversión value global para aquellos que no la conozcan. Eh, Básicamente, Pavel lo que busca en 3G es encontrar buenos negocios con buenos equipos directivos y intentar hacerlo, obviamente, como intenta hacer el value investing, a buenos precios. Eso sí, no solo en mercados desarrollados, sino también en mercados emergentes. La sesión de hoy me parece especialmente interesante, tanto para profesionales de la inversión como para pues, inversores particulares, porque nos obliga a revisar algunas ideas que muchas veces podemos dar por sentadas en el value investing, un poco esos mantras de pues, si tenemos que ignorar la macro, si el foco del negocio siempre es la mejor estrategia, si el crecimiento rápido debe tratarse con escepticismo o si puede ser algo más sólido o si la calidad del equipo directivo puede pesar mucho en ciertos entornos y sobre todo cuando hablamos de mercados emergentes. Como estaba anunciado el evento, Pavel hará la presentación en inglés, pero bueno, quería aprovechar para hacer un poco la intro en castellano. Y después de la presentación, abriremos el turno de preguntas para que nos hacéis llegar por el chat un poco las preguntas que tengáis respecto a o bien los temas de la presentación o alguna cosa relacionada. Y bueno, nada más. Pavel, thank you very much for joining us here again at Value School, this time at Value School Pro. It's a pleasure to have you here. And good afternoon to everyone. I've already introduced Pavel in Spanish. I will just do it very briefly also in English, just in case. Pavel is the co-founder of 3G Capital. He has more than 2 decades of experience investing globally, following the value investing principles, trying to find undervalued businesses across developed and emerging markets. And what I feel makes this session today really valuable is that Pavel will not only talk about value investing as this set of timeless principles, which we may already know if you're well versed in value investing, but also about how those principles may apply nowadays and how they need to be adapted when we move beyond investing in developed markets. And I also think that many of the classic value investing maxims were developed in a very specific context, a large, stable, relatively homogeneous economy with deep capital markets and strong institutions. But Pavel's presentation today would challenge us to ask a very important question, which is, do those maxims apply in the same way whenever you're investing? It doesn't matter the time or independently of the market. And yes, today we'll discuss topics such as macro and political risk, competitive advantage, sustainability of growth, the role of management in business development, and how to think about valuation and risk when the opportunity is much broader, but at the same time, it's more complex and it also has more risks added. So Pavel, again, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours. You can start with the presentation. Let me share it very briefly.
Well, Andre, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, I'd like to talk to you about value investing in a global context. So more specifically, I'd like to cover the lessons that we had to learn as we were starting out as US-focused investors. But more important, I'd like to talk to you about the lessons that we had to subsequently unlearn as we went global. So before we begin, I'd like to provide some basic background information about 3G Capital. So we are global value investing specialists. We invest in undervalued businesses around the world. Our universe includes frontier, emerging, and developed markets. And if you were to summarize our investment approach, I'd say that we invest in industry-leading businesses at single-digit multiples of earnings. We've been in business for over 22 years, and between my partner, Corey Bailey, and myself, we have over half a century of investment experience on a combined basis. In the course of our existence, we produced a track record of significant outperformance versus the international benchmark, so you can see the numbers here on the slide. So with the background information out of the way, I'd like to talk to you about applying value investing concept globally. So as you think about it, what you're going to see is that you had generations of successful value investors who made a very good living applying value investment principles as they were developed in the United States over many decades. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, would those principles be still relevant if applied in a global context? Because obviously, once you go around the world, what you're going to see is that different countries, they have vastly different sets of environmental circumstances. So the question is, would the principles developed in the United States, would they be too rigid ideologically to be applied globally without critically evaluating them? And would they be holding investors back? So with that, I'd like to summarize sort of like those core value beliefs that formed over the years in the US as a result of successfully applying the value investing approach. Here, there are four of them. The first one is to ignore macro and politics and just focus on the economics of the business. The second one is sticking with industry leaders who are laser-like focused on the core business and they avoid venturing outside of the circle of competence into the unrelated fields. The third one is assuming that rapid growth is not sustainable over the long term and therefore should not be taken into account once it's time to come up with the appraisal of business value. And lastly, the fourth core belief is that business economics have primacy over management skill. And so let's explore each one of those core beliefs that formed in the United States over the many decades to see if they would be any different had value investing if value investing was born outside the US and developed under a vastly different set of circumstances. So let's start with core principle number one, which is to ignore macro and politics. And here we can start with a quote from Buffett, and he has said that he would normally ignore political and economic forecasts and just focus on the economics of the business. And I think one thing that we have to realize is that if you look at the United States as a country, over the past century, it has been the preeminent economic and military power. So as an investor in the United States, you were very well insulated from outside influences, but also from sort of the internal influences we would normally emanate from excessive government meddling. If you look at all the other countries in the world, they never had any military or economic might to impact the US standing because the US was so much more powerful. Also, the US has had the culture of freedom such that political arguments would normally not be settled at the expense of business matters, and the government would normally behave sort of in a very light touch manner with businesses and not try to meddle excessively. And of course, the outcome of that sort of external and internal insulation was significant growth and stability over the past century. And as a result, a US-based investor could have safely ignored macroeconomic and political considerations and just focus on the economics of the business. So they never had to worry about any kind of sanctions that could have been imposed in the US by someone, or any kind of military invasions, or perhaps government behaving in a heavy-handed manner. However, if you look around the world, you see that the situation is vastly different. Why? Well, because most countries around the world are going to be significantly less powerful than the United States, both in an economic sense and also in a military sense, which means that other countries could significantly impact their range of economic outcomes and even societal outcomes in case of military action. you can have politics and economics being tightly intertwined in such a manner that political disagreements could have major economic consequences. And sometimes in those places, governments may behave in a heavy-handed manner with respect to businesses in order to extract either social services or, worse yet, personal services. And so as a result of those much less insulated from external influences and subject to internal undercurrents, you would just face, as the economy in that country, you'd be subject to a much wider range of economic outcomes. There'd be much more economic volatility. And as a result, at extremes of that volatility, you could have a defining impact on individual businesses, no matter how attractive the economics are. And so as a global investor, you really should be mindful of macroeconomic and political considerations in addition to just looking at the economics of the business. Core belief number 2, focus on the core business. And to start with a quote by Charlie Munger, he said that in life and in business, the goal is to build a circle of competence and then operate within it. And of course, if you are in the US market historically, you see that great many fortunes have been made in the US by investing in enterprises that single-handedly focused on their core business and avoided venturing into the unrelated fields. So those enterprises, they achieved competitively advantaged mastery of their domain to dominate the domain, and then they avoided venturing outside the circle of competence. And it's a long list of enterprises. You have Boeing, you have Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Gillette, McDonald's, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And generations of value investors, especially in the US, they built their methods around this stay within the circle of competence approach. Now, if you go outside the US, you see a different picture. So for example, rather than using the mastering the competitively advantaged expertise within a specific domain, there are just a lot of businesses outside the US that developed a competitively advantaged approach, and then they would apply that approach across a constantly expanding number of domains. It's a shorter list, but you can look at companies such as Amazon in the US, Samsung in South Korea, BYD in China, or Kaspi in Kazakhstan. And what they all have in common is that, as opposed to sort of developing dominance of a specific domain with respect to their competitive advantage, they said, listen, we're going to develop an approach which is in itself competitively advantaged, and then we would just apply that approach across different domains. So Amazon is a good example of that. They basically initially used that approach, which was centered around customer service obsession combined with technology-driven innovation in order to dominate the original domain or the original circle of competence in online book selling. Well, they didn't really stop there, because if they did, they would probably just be known as the book selling outfit. Instead, what they did, they took that competitively advantaged approach and they successfully applied it to a wide range of industries, for example, cloud and others. And basically, they would just look to expand that approach to those industries where the competitive leadership was driven by the same factors as the online selling. And I think early on, Bezos was actually questioned about expanding into other domains. And people said, look, you have to stay with your competitive advantage of selling books. And he countered to that. He just said, listen, my competitive advantage is not selling books. So it's not the domain specific advantage. My advantage is the approach. which is basically, focus on the customer service and technology-driven innovation. And we can successfully apply that across different businesses, of which cloud was one. So the conclusion here is that investors should really consider a definition of competitive advantage once they are national, and they should not just include those businesses that dominate their specific domain, but also include those businesses that mastered the competitively advantaged approach that they can then apply across a different number of domains that are outside of the original circle of competence. The next belief that developed over the years of value invested in the US is the fact that rapid growth is not sustainable. And Carol Loomis of Fortune magazine penned that article back in the late 90s called the 15% delusion. And that article has been frequently quoted by Buffett. And basically, the conclusion is that it's very difficult for large companies to hit a 15% target in earnings growth over any extended periods. And the author concluded, well, rightly so, based on the data that she had at her disposal, that it's very hard or almost impossible for fast growth to persist in the long term. And what the data show is that most businesses, they grow at less than 10% over the long term. And therefore, the conclusion here is that you should not really assign any extra value to growth when you look into estimate the intrinsic value of a business. But of course, that study was done in the US using US data. And once you get outside the US, I think you face a very different set of circumstances. I think just structurally, you just have a lot of difference between US economies and the economies outside the US. And if you apply that core principle outside the US, it might lead to wrong decisions. So if you look abroad, especially in those emerging and frontier markets, what you see is that a lot of those countries, they are undergoing rapid economic transformation as they go from planned economies into market economies. So as such, they might have a century of growth compressed in a couple of decades. As a result, they have inherently higher economic growth, much faster than you would have seen in the US over time. Now, in addition to that, if you look at leading businesses in those economies, they have a better ability to capture a larger share of the growing pie quicker. There are a couple of reasons for it. Number one, the distribution of talent and knowledge in those economies is much less even versus the United States, because in the United States, that knowledge and talent is fairly evenly distributed across the competitive spectrum. In those smaller transforming economies, that talent is knowledge is normally concentrated within market leaders. And as a result, they can consolidate those markets at the expense of less knowledgeable competitors a lot faster. They also have the advantage of hindsight. So in the US, we had to build things from the ground up. So there was a lot of trial and error. Those businesses in those economies undergoing transformation, they can just look at what had happened in the United States, and they can basically just build a better mousetrap using the benefit of hindsight. They're not building from the ground up. They can just design something already knowing what works and what doesn't. And so you have this combination of faster underlying economic growth in those economies themselves. And then you also have this faster market consolidation potential. And once you combine the two, you have this rapid economic growth, which is actually sustainable over the long term, unlike perhaps in the US. And therefore, once it comes to those emerging and frontier markets, it pays to take that growth into account once valuing the business and assessing the intrinsic value. Finally, economics prevail over management. That's been one of the core principles of value investing as well. And I think Warren Buffett is known for saying that when a management with the reputation for brilliance tackles a business with a reputation for bad economics, it's the reputation of the business that remains intact. However, that is something that is based on the U.S. experience. Is it different internationally? Well, let's see. Obviously, in the U.S., I think that principle would let people focus on the businesses that even an idiot can run, because sooner or later one will. And data for the U.S. market, you see that historically in the U.S., simple and structurally sound businesses, they performed well, even if management quality ebbed and flowed. You can look at a number of examples. You can look at Coca-Cola and Gillette. Their management was fairly poor in the late 90s, early 2000s. And yet, if you look at the competitive integrity of their franchises, I think it was well maintained throughout this period, and those businesses kept doing fairly well. And of course, Buffett was an investor in both. And then if you look at Nebraska Furniture Mart, which is again close to home, wholly owned by Buffett, it was initially run by the founder, Rose Blumkin. After she departed, the management was underwhelming, so to speak. And yet, the Nebraska Furniture Mart continued its domination of the Omaha furniture market. Another example from the tech land is Microsoft. If you look at Microsoft, they're known to have had the worst management team of all the tech companies from about 2000 through 2014. They missed search, they missed mobile. Initially, they missed cloud. And yet, if you look at their track record of profitability throughout this period, it still had remained one of the most profitable companies in the world. So in the US, it was definitely a primacy of business economics over management. And yet, again, in the US, you can look at circumstances where an all-star management team was handed a complex competitive challenge and see what happened. And basically what happened is every time they tried to take on a complex competitive task, they failed miserably. A few examples here. So you can look at Berkshire-owned See's Candies, and it was led by Berkshire All-Star CEO Chuck Huggins. He tried to expand See's Candies brand outside his West Coast stronghold. They wanted to take it nationally, and that effort failed because they just, from a competitive point, just couldn't really crack those new markets. You can look at the example of Tesco. Again, at that time, Berkshire owned a stake in Tesco. The CEO of Tesco, he was the most admired businessman in the UK, did a great job at Tesco, Terry Lee, and they expanded in the US. And guess what? Again, failed miserably, had to close down the business. Another example is a healthcare services venture called Haben, and it was backed by Berkshire, Amazon, JP Morgan, like really all-star team of investors. And it was led by Atul Gawande, a highly respected doctor who was handpicked by Munger. And what happened? After 17 months, they had to shut it down because they could just not compete with the established players. So obviously, management talent could not overcome the business-driven competitive disadvantage. And yet another case is JCPenney in the US. They hired Ron Johnson, who was the architect of Apple's retail model. and he was basically the guy responsible for the creation of that whole retail experience at Apple. Did really well with it. And then once he was handed JCPenney and he tried to take on the entrenched department store rivals, same thing, failed miserably. It just didn't work. And why is that? Well, it is because the US is a highly homogeneous and a highly developed market. So the US market is highly consolidated across incomes, geographies, and behaviors, which leaves fewer attack angles for a competitive challenger. Furthermore, in the US, talent and knowledge, they're evenly distributed across the competitive spectrum, which makes it hard to gain a competency advantage. In contrast, across emerging and frontier markets, you see a picture that is structurally different. Those markets are highly fragmented with respect to incomes, regions, behaviors, creating chinks in the armor of the incumbents. And also, the distribution of talent and knowledge in those markets is highly uneven, which makes it possible to concentrate expertise to overcome business driven competitive disadvantages. And if you look at a number of businesses that manage to accomplish the impossible, that kind of tells you that at times, brilliant management can overcome poor start in economics. One case would be BYD in China. They were in cell phone components, they were in batteries. And then Wang Chanfu, the founder and CEO, decided to expand into autos where he had no prior experience whatsoever. And I believe Buffett advised him against doing so because he figured, well, poor economics. So no matter how brilliant you are, you're just not going to be able to make it work. And yet Wang Chanfu went into autos and managed to succeed beyond the wildest dreams. Another one is PDD in China, an e-commerce online player. They basically started from scratch, took on Alibaba and JD, who were the 800-pound gorillas, and they ended up winning the battle. Another one is Kaspi in Kazakhstan, which is an super app in Kazakhstan. They expanded into payments, took on Visa and MasterCard, and beat them to the punch. And basically, within 2 years, they reduced Visa and MasterCard from being the number one, number two players controlling over 80% of payments in Kazakhstan to them having less than 15% market share. So the conclusion here is that once you go global, then you should be open to the notion of making bolder bets in management rather than overly focusing on current business economics. So that concludes the presentation part of my speech, but with that, I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have.
Yes, Pavel, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you for the insightful presentation. We'll wait for some questions in chat if anyone wants to ask anything, but I'll be starting with the first one. And I've tried to structure some questions also in the same order as you presented some of these maxims or queries. And the first one is going to be a double one. It's going to be a double whammy. So it's related to, at the same time, the macro variables that you would look at, but specifically in emerging markets, right? Because you've talked about how emerging or frontier markets, they compress decades of development or growth in a very short period of time. So when you look at equities in those markets, there has to be some risk, some discount that's being applied to those companies, no matter what the growth is, right? So how do you avoid overpaying for that growth? Are there or do these companies or these equities, the equities of the companies, also trade at really expensive multiples, as you would expect a company with those financial metrics to be trading in a more developed country? And specifically, what are those reasons why these equities would be trading at a discount? They would become not only a great company but a good or a good investment, because otherwise they would be fairly valued and it wouldn't make sense to invest in them.
Right. Well, that's a lot of questions at once, so I'll try to go one by one. So, and if I miss anything, you just let me know.
Okay.
So I think how you avoid overpaying for them. I think the number one principle is to make sure that anytime you look at the business valuation and sort of the private market value comparison to the value of the enterprise in the public market, I think you compare local valuation of private versus local valuation of public. So you want to be sure that the discount you get is a discount versus local private market values rather than the discount versus a comparable business in the US, for example. So this way, you know that you're not really arbing the international risk premium. So that's number one. Then I think the next one was the next question was about growth and as to whether they would always be selling at a very high valuation. So like you wouldn't really, as a value investor, you wouldn't have a reason to even invest in it in the first place. And I think that on average, yes, you'd normally see them selling at a valuation that is quite high. So, probably 9 cases out of 10 as a value investor, you probably would want to pass on them. However, I think again, as a value investor, you're always looking for that like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, where for some illogical reason, you have a business that's very high quality, great growth runway, but for some irrational reason, it is selling at a discount to value. And again, all you need is one. You don't need 10 of them. And I think that's sort of the way to proceed. And with those ones that are expensive, obviously you don't need to buy them, but at least you can look at them, you can analyze them, and get to know them intimately, and then just wait for a chance to buy them at an attractive valuation should something happen that does really impact the long-term value of the business, but creates bad optics, and therefore gets you a chance to buy them at a low multiple of earnings.
Yes, and regarding this, investment opportunities in emerging markets, I was thinking about more like what can be the risks that the market is discounting in those prices so they become reasonable or attractive to you. Let's say, for example, I don't know, currency risks or government instability or likely government intervention. You've mentioned some markets, for example, Kaspi. I think it's a really interesting one from Kazakhstan. I've never looked into the equities market of Kazakhstan, so maybe you can give us an example with that company. Like, at what multiple did you find this company, and how did you find it, and why did it look attractive?
Well, initially we looked at Kaspi when it was selling for 25 times earnings, which is way too high a multiple for us to get interested. Now, I was attracted to Kaspi as a business because I saw that they have a very unique characteristic in its management, because that management team has a track record of tackling the impossible challenges more than once. And that sort of gave me confidence that over time this business is going to be much bigger than it currently is, as they're going to keep successfully tackling challenge after challenge. But of course, I wasn't willing to pay 25 times for it. And then at some point, we got a chance to buy it at a much lower price because there was some turmoil in Eastern Europe. So I think that was sort of a factor that people thought, oh, maybe there's going to be turmoil in Kazakhstan as well. But as we looked into it, we just didn't think the risk of that happening was even close to being sort of a real threat. Then it got even cheaper because there was a short report that came out, and there were a number of allegations in the short report, which again were either outright lies or something that was just inaccurate. So again, like there was just really no blemish there. And then later on, there were some general macroeconomic concerns about Kazakhstan, which really were sort of very general nature, so that they wouldn't really impact the core business of Kaspi. And as a result of that, we've been able to buy Kaspi at about 5 times earnings, and a double-digit dividend yield, and that would be a very attractive price for any kind of business. But for a business that has the capacity to grow at probably 15 to 20% or more in US dollars, has 50% plus margins, and has a management team with a phenomenal track record. I mean, that's just, it's a throwaway bargain price. And like I said, beyond the competitive position of the business itself, I was really attracted to management, and not because they told me where the business is going to be in 10 years, but because looking at their track record, was highly impressive. Just to be more specific, they took this business from a standing start in 2008, and just over a decade later, they grew the business to earn over $1 billion in profits. So if you look across the world for management teams that were able to grow from zero to over $1 billion in profits, there are just very, very few. I think there's probably going to be less than a dozen. And they did it in a small economy, and they did it by tackling a number of challenges that people would say are just like impossible to solve. And like I said, they managed to beat Visa and MasterCard in payments, which again, people would say that's not possible to even accomplish. Then they managed to dislodge Alibaba from being number one in e-commerce in Kazakhstan to become number one e-commerce player in Kazakhstan. And, and the list goes on. So they kind of goes back to me talking about them developing this competitively advantaged approach. And then they applied that approach across a number of different domains, which were outside of their initial circle of competence. And yet, because of that approach, they came to dominate them. And they did it like in groceries, in travel, et cetera, et cetera. So whichever domain they expanded into, they would normally become very successful. So again, kind of flies into the face of this value investment principle of focusing on the core business. But again, like I said, once you go outside the US, you should be open to the notion of the world being different. And I think Kaspi is an example of that.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, but you already answered to my question. I was already formulating it in my head, which is, what is the key metric of exceptional management? What do you look at? But I guess it's going to be, this track record of capital allocation, how they, manage the, the culture inside their company. So I will change a little bit the question, if you don't mind. I'm going to ask you something very specific, which I think it's interesting. You mentioned about Kaspi that you had some sort of, short report that was published. And I'm really curious, and I would like to pick your brain about this. How do you act whenever one of your investment theses do not go its way, or, for example, you find some of these one-offs, such as a short report? What would you normally do when, an investment that you're already looking after for some time and you feel like you're very comfortable with the business, you have this very bad news? Because this also tells a lot about you and your personality and, what makes you a great value investor, I feel like.
Well, first order of the business is to go through the report of the bad news to make sure that, the sort of the bad news, just to see if the bad news is real or is it completely imaginary. So I think
also, sorry to interrupt. How did the market react to this short report? Do you remember?
Yeah, of course we remember. Yeah, the stock price was down significantly. It was down, double digits, for sure. So it was a big negative impact on the stock price. But of course, you can't really be dismissive or accepting of any short report, I think you have to always say, okay, let's just look at the data and see if the data aligns with the reality or not. And specifically with respect to Caspi, we looked at the data, and what we realized is that the short report did not align with the reality, and there were actually a number of things that were just outright incorrect. And basically, we just concluded that from a business perspective, that didn't really change our view of the business at all. And therefore, we basically said, listen, the stock price is now lower versus where it used to be, so it's more attractive. So to the extent that we had new inflows, we actually ended up adding to the position. Mm-hmm. But of course, if we looked into the short report and it so happened that the report was truthful, we would have said, well, you know what, maybe we made a mistake with Caspi and we need to sell. So I think the lesson here for us would be just to keep an open mind, and to the extent that new data comes in, even though the data might be contrary to our initial thinking, we should have no problem turning around and making a different decision.
Okay, that's fair. And I saw you moving your head around a little bit when I was talking about like what do you value and what do you consider as being, some key metrics that represent exceptional management teams. I don't know if you want to add something to that, but maybe
yeah, sure.
Yes, go ahead.
For sure, like we can use Caspi as an example, and actually, ironically, I think the same qualities they make a great investor, the same qualities make a great manager, and that's the ability to change your opinion as new data come in. So with respect to Caspi, I think their underlying principle in the business is to create products and services that people love. And they use Net Promoter Score as their sort of like guiding light. And every product and service that they make, you have to be above a certain cutoff. And I think the company-wide NPS for Caspi is 82, which I believe is higher than that of Apple and Google. And so what happened with the business historically is that at some point they had this product, the credit card product, that was 40% of their profit. And as they were analyzing the business and reviewing it, what they realized is that the NPS score for that credit card operation was negative. And they said, listen, like, can we fix it? And they came to the conclusion that they couldn't fix it because by nature, the credit card business is such that you always have charges for like late payments and maybe being over the limit. And you're always going to have people having negative experiences with it. And basically, the management team of Caspi, led by Mikhail Mtadze, they just said, listen, this business right now contributes 40% to our profits. Now we can keep it, but if we keep it, we're going to make this money for some time, but it's going to corrupt the very DNA of our business model, which is to create products and services that customers love. So long term, it's just going to really damage the business. And therefore, within 48 hours, they made a decision to just shut it down. So they said, listen, we're happy to make a very difficult decision to shut down the business that contributes almost half our profits in order to be successful over the next decade. And I'd say that's a hallmark of exceptional management, because most people in their circumstances, I bet you they wouldn't do it. They would just either avoid making the decision, or maybe they would say, well, you know what, let's just keep it because it's very profitable. But Caspi team, they did the right thing, even though it was very difficult to do. So I think that's one of the things where I look at it, that's hallmark of the great management. And sort of even beyond that, as you look at management teams, I think a great management team is the team that actually has the strategic vision, but can also execute day to day. And there are not many management teams like that, but at Caspi, they have both the vision and the ability to execute day to day. So, their products, again, judging by their Net Promoter Scores, you can tell that they're just, come out perfect. And they're saying that they're like, their mode of operation is to digitize any product and service that can be digitized to make consumer life easier. And that's kind of what they have in their DNA. But of course, they had a strategic vision of saying back in 2008, well, in 10 years' time, we're going to have this business that's going to have all those multiple funnels of e-commerce combined into one. So we're not just going to have payments or fintech or e-commerce or travel. We're going to have all this stuff in a single app.
Well, that's really interesting. Certainly an outlier, as you would say. And to wrap it up, we're just going to do a very last question, very briefly. And I wanted to ask you, after more than 20 years of experience, I don't know if it's going to be one of these 4 maxims you presented to us today, or maybe a different one, but what investment belief have you changed your mind the most on, or which one do you regret the most of not changing it sooner?
Well, I'll go with a couple. I'd say number one, in the beginning, we were overly focused on the valuation at the expense of maybe business quality and management quality. And what we discovered is that it really doesn't matter if you pay 7 times earnings or 8 times earnings if the business and management are great. Because if they're not great, paying 7 times versus 8 times is not really going to save you. And if they're great, then paying 8 times versus 7 is not really going to reduce your return by that much. So this is the number one lesson, that the primacy of quality over the price, again, doesn't mean that we're willing to pay 25 times, but we're just a lot less picky about valuations when it comes to sort of the lower end of the spectrum. And second, I think we came to realize that brilliant management can be worth quite a bit. And sometimes you should be willing to bet with management, not with the business. But again, that's one of the beliefs of value investing, or the original beliefs, I should say, that business sort of has primacy over management skill. But I've seen enough of it where I've seen certain management teams, again, outside the US for the most part, that were able to kind of overcome that business-driven competitive disadvantage by applying just they sort of concentrating that expertise and having the talent and the knowledge to be able to create something very unique despite the initial competitive disadvantage.
Well, thank you very much, Pavel. It's been a pleasure having you here at Value School Pro. I think the main takeaway for many of us is that value investing is not just a fixed set of formulas or the set of mantras that we learn when we start studying value investing. It is more of a discipline based on price, value, business quality, management quality, risk control, and we need to take all of that into account and try to adapt. Also, value investing has changed throughout time, or let's say the economic environment has changed, the competitive environment has changed also, and we need to adapt our ideas and maybe practice a little bit more of a modern value investing approach to be able to be successful in the markets, and you've proved it, outperforming your benchmark. Also, your presentation, I think it's a very useful reminder that investing globally requires both discipline, as I was saying before, flexibility. And yes, thank you very much for joining us at Value School Pro. It's been a pleasure. I will switch very briefly to Spanish to also give farewell to our audience. Así que, como está diciendo en inglés, sorry for, yeah, I think they heard you. Muchas gracias, Pavel, por acompañarnos hoy, y muchísimas gracias también a todos vosotros que nos habéis acompañado desde casa en este webinar de Value School Pro. Como decía, un poco la sesión de hoy nos deja varias ideas bastante útiles para cualquier profesional de inversión, como la importancia de no aplicar los principios del value investing de manera excesivamente mecánica o rígida, también la necesidad de entender más el contexto de cada mercado o también del momento de mercado en el que estamos, ya no solo geográficamente. el papel que puede tener un buen equipo directivo, como nos ha explicado Pavel con el ejemplo de Kaspi, en Kazajstán, que además es un mercado que pocos tendemos a conocer, y sobre todo también la diferencia entre comprar algo que simplemente es barato, ¿no?, y que puede parecer una buena inversión, y comprar un buen negocio bien gestionado con un margen de seguridad, pues bueno, quizás un poco más limitado a lo que estamos acostumbrados, pero que también por esa parte, digamos que si pensamos en el múltiplo como la parte del numerador y del denominador, que tiene también margen para seguir creciendo y que va a ser una buena inversión también gracias a ese crecimiento o al buen hacer del equipo directivo o a que simplemente es un buen negocio y de calidad. Así que nada, como siempre, esperamos que esta sesión os haya resultado útil, tanto desde un punto de vista profesional como de un punto de vista más formativo o didáctico. Y nada, muchísimas gracias a todos. Os emplazo a revisar la agenda de eventos que tenemos en Value School y también en Value School Pro y nos vemos en un nuevo evento. Hasta luego.
Thank